Witness the horror, the true survival of a medieval peasant in winter. The biting wind howls down from the mountain. The cold is relentless, and the bare trees sway like skeletons, stripped of all the life they once held. But this isn't just any winter story. No, this is the story of a man, a medieval peasant, who defied the forces of nature with nothing but his courage, cunning, and an unbreakable will to survive. Imagine a world where resources are scarce, where snow swallows everything in its path, and hunger is a constant threat, where a human life is worth as little as the thatch covering their cracked roof. In a scenario where the few survivors depend on every moment, every breath, every blade of hay to escape the death that stalks them. Did you know that medieval peasants faced more than just the cold? They faced invisible monsters, devastating diseases, and a constant battle against nature itself, which showed no mercy. They were caught between winter's sword and its unforgiving wall, with choices that often defined who would live and who would perish. In this chilling account, you will be taken deep into the frozen forests, into the mud huts, where the sound of the wind isn't just a breeze, it's a mortal warning. What did it truly mean to fight the medieval winter? How could a man, armed only with his skills, survive without the tools we have today? And what happened when help never arrived, when others were too busy fighting for their own survival? You will discover the grim realities of the medieval winter, the fight for food, the invisible enemies that lurked in the darkness, and the unthinkable decisions a peasant had to make. But there's something few people know. Some did survive, and their resilience, their sacrifices, are as haunting as the death that surrounded them. How did they do it? What were the limits of human endurance when confronted with the cruelest of seasons? What hides beneath the layers of ice and fog? What remains when you look at survival in its most brutal aspects? Prepare to be transported to a past where human lives were fragile, but the strength of the spirit was incomparable. Do you have the courage to witness true survival? As weeks passed and temperatures plummeted, the nights grew longer and more relentless. Darkness was a threat in itself, swallowing everything, even hope. But the peasant, or rather the survivor, had no luxury of lamenting. The medieval winter offered no mercy. It didn't just kill with cold, it destroyed minds and hearts. A simple mistake, a small oversight, could be the end. Everyone knew this, and yet, many continued to live day after day, as if tomorrow was never guaranteed, and in fact it wasn't. During the darkest months of the year, those who survived the snowstorms and hunger faced yet another threat: isolation. Peasants were forced to stay away from any form of help, isolated deep within remote villages. The fear of the unknown, of strangers who might appear in the forests seeking food, of diseases that could decimate an entire village in a few days, was constant. But the worst of all terrors was what lay within their own cabins. Daily life consisted of a constant battle against the cold. Homes, often made of raw wood and mud, had no heating like the ones we know today. Fire was their only friend, and even the slightest carelessness with it could result in an even worse tragedy: a fire. The wood supporting the house could become a treacherous ally, and the roof that once promised protection now posed a threat with the slightest spark. And as winter stretched on, food, already scarce, began to dwindle. Peasants needed skill to store, hunt, and plant, but sometimes none of it was enough. The only food available was what they could grow, or, at best, hunt. But hunts in the frozen forests, where snow made every movement risky, were a game of life and death. When the wild animals of the forest became scarcer, all that remained was the bitter decision to face starvation or seek help from neighbors, something that in times of war and distrust wasn't always a safe option. And who spoke of winter's diseases? Those fortunate enough to survive the cold were often struck down by plagues and fevers, like the Black Death, which spread rapidly, decimating entire villages. The most terrifying thing is that most diseases had no cure, and there were no doctors or medicines to alleviate the pain. A medieval peasant's body not only faced frostbite, but also the slow, festering death from infections that in our time are curable with antibiotics. But survival wasn't just about facing the elements or disease. There was something even more terrifying: the constant threat of violence. Imagine for a moment the peasant who ventured into the forest to hunt. It wasn't just the wild beast he feared, but also other men, desperate, hungry, ready to steal whatever was necessary to sustain life. Winter brought a kind of silent aggression, an invisible struggle between humans that grew fiercer with each colder night. And even with all this, the peasants stood firm. Each day was a silent war, but everyone knew the only choice was to continue. There was no hope for significant improvement. Winter was nothing but a bitter promise that the worst was yet to come. Women and children were also central to this struggle. They helped prepare what little they had for winter, chopping wood, baking bread, and making preserves. But the children, they too were forced to learn survival tricks from an early age. How to recognize signs of disease, how to protect what little they had against the incursions of other humans, how to survive the meager heat of the fire and the poison of the biting cold. It was training that began very early. You must be wondering, but how could anyone survive all this? Well, that's something many failed to discover. What separated the survivor from the frozen corpse was a set of skills few possessed, but which, for those who had them, was vital. There was a secret, something not taught in schools, something passed down from generation to generation: the true spirit of resistance. What seemed impossible, a man with few resources and an iron will could achieve. Now, I invite you to follow me, for the true story of medieval survival goes beyond myths and legends. It is filled with cruel choices, with moments that tested the limits of human endurance. Because when winter arrives, and death isn't just in the wind but also inside your home, you discover what human beings are truly made of. Follow me as I unveil the darkest details and survival strategies few knew and many forgot. And as the days dragged on, and winter continued its brutal march, the true battle was just beginning. It wasn't just the biting cold or the immense hunger that transformed the medieval winter into a nightmare. It was the mindset the peasant had to adopt just to survive. Each dawn was a new challenge. As the sun barely broke the horizon, men and women were already outside, facing the brutality of a world that seemed to have forgotten how to be warm. The frigid air cut like knives, and the frozen ground made every step a risk. Sunlight was fleeting, and even when it appeared, its presence dissipated in a matter of hours. Winter was long, cruel, and relentless, a constant challenge that offered no rest. Can you imagine the feeling of your fingers frozen numb, your flesh so cold you can no longer feel anything? Now imagine that for months on end, without adequate gloves, without coats like the ones we know today, peasants did the impossible to endure the suffering, many covering themselves with animal furs. They hunted, but which weren't always enough. It was a constant struggle to maintain circulation, and the risk of gangrene, when the body slowly began to decay from within, was never far off. But the fight against the cold was just the beginning. The worst part was how, even with a fire lit, people still slowly died from the cold. There was no escape. Straw beds were miserable, offering little warmth, and when someone fell ill, the cold made recovery almost impossible. Often beds were shared by several people, all huddled together, trying to find warmth that seemed to constantly slip away. Every movement was uncomfortable, and with each passing day, the fear of death became more real. Food, as we've already mentioned, was another battle. Salted meats and hard bread were all that remained when harvests had been insufficient. Potatoes, wheat, roots, what was meant to sustain life often hastened its end. Forgetting a grain of wheat here, a lack of water there, and you'd be fighting to stay alive. If winter lingered for more than a few months, hunger began to gnaw, first at the extremities, then at the mind. And make no mistake, hunger was a real enemy, not just for the pain of an empty stomach, but for the transformation it caused in the human soul. As food became scarcer, the competition among peasants intensified. What seemed to be a quiet and peaceful place, a small village isolated in the middle of the countryside, transformed into a war zone. Solidarity began to unravel. Distrust became more palpable. Hunger, more than anything else, revealed the worst human instincts. Yet there was still something within the survivors that would not yield to the darkness. What kept them standing? What made them continue to search for something, even when all seemed lost, was a force older than themselves. The instinct to survive. It was the courage they had been cultivating since childhood, when cold and pain were constants. Each new day, each new obstacle, made them stronger, more resilient, more adapted to a world that challenged them with every breath. But what many often didn't know was that this instinct to survive didn't come alone. It brought with it the weight of fear, hopelessness, and often loneliness. Those who survived the cruelest winter did so not just with courage, but with a shadow in their hearts. The fear of losing their family, their children, their own lives, haunted them more than any other evil winter could bring. Among the frozen forests, there was also the silent threat of other human beings. When food was scarce and loneliness was unbearable, the temptation to invade a neighbor's land, or even a known acquaintance's home, became an option. Winter stripped many of their discernment, causing the desire to survive to override morality. These men and women, often seen as heroes for the resistance they showed, were also confronted with their own inner demons. There was something else that few perceived. Amidst all the difficulties, the medieval winter wasn't just a battle against nature. It was a test of character, to see who would be able to maintain their humanity in the face of extreme suffering. Those who failed this test, who surrendered to despair, often disappeared without a trace. Some froze to death in the forests. Others succumbed to diseases, but there were those who somehow managed to resist. Now think for a moment. What was it that made these few survive? What separated the living from the dead? Was it luck, fate, or was there something deeper, more essential, that allowed them to continue? These questions will never be completely answered. But if you look closely, you will see something that even today, at the heart of history, makes us question what it means to be human. It's not just about physical strength, or hunting prowess, or even the ability to keep a fire lit. It's about an innate desire to keep going, to not yield to the darkness, to never give up. And now, as the wind outside blows ever stronger, it's impossible not to wonder, how far would you go to survive? How far would you go to protect your loved ones, to ensure that tomorrow would still hold some light? The medieval survival story is a story of extreme resilience, of impossible choices, of unthinkable sacrifices, and it will never be forgotten, because it's not just about the past, but about the human spirit, which continues to fight, even when all seems lost. This is the true story of survival. As winter advanced, the land became an extension of the nightmare itself. Beneath the thick layer of snow, villages seemed swallowed by silence. Where there once had been laughter and conversations, now only the sound of embers crackling in homes remained, as if the fire itself were also fighting not to be extinguished. In the minds of the peasants, with each sleepless night, the thought was the same: how much longer will the cold last? And each day, the challenge renewed itself. It wasn't just the fight for food, or the fear of the biting cold. It was also the struggle for the spirit. Winter didn't lose its strength. Winter made people question everything, even their very reason for going on. Children who once ran through the forests were now shadows of themselves. Their gaze, once bright with curiosity, was now empty, reflecting an uncertain future, where the only certainty was the cold, which made every movement slower, more painful. The elders, those who had lived more than their souls could bear, became burdens. There was no more room for kindness. The pain of survival consumed every piece of humanity. But somehow, People still fed on the stories they told each other, on memories of a distant summer, of feasts that would happen someday, or even of something they considered a miracle. However, increasingly, these miracles seemed distant. Who could survive without losing their humanity in such a merciless time? Those houses, poorly protected from the wind, were no longer safe havens. The fear of fire mingled with the fear of cold. A single mistake when lighting the fire could mean the ruin of the entire village. And in such a cruel winter, ruin meant more than the loss of a home. It meant the loss of everything. What kept them standing? What made them continue to search for something, even when all seemed lost, was a force older than themselves. The instinct to survive. It was the courage they had been cultivating since childhood, when cold and pain were constants. Each new day, each new obstacle, made them stronger, more resilient, more adapted to a world that challenged them with every breath. But what many often didn't know was that this instinct to survive didn't come alone. It brought with it the weight of fear, hopelessness, and often loneliness. Those who survived the cruelest winter did so not just with courage, but with a shadow in their hearts. The fear of losing their family, their children, their own lives, haunted them more than any other evil winter could bring. Among the frozen forests, there was also the silent threat of other human beings. When food was scarce and loneliness was unbearable, the temptation to invade a neighbor's land, or even a known acquaintance's home, became an option. Winter stripped many of their discernment, causing the desire to survive to override morality. These men and women, often seen as heroes for the resistance they showed, were also confronted with their own inner demons. There was something else that few perceived. Amidst all the difficulties, the medieval winter wasn't just a battle against nature. It was a test of character, to see who would be able to maintain their humanity in the face of extreme suffering. Those who failed this test, who surrendered to despair, often disappeared without a trace. Some froze to death in the forests, others succumbed to diseases, but there were those who somehow managed to resist. Now think for a moment, what was it that made these few survive? What separated the living from the dead? Was it luck, fate, or was there something deeper, more essential, that allowed them to continue? These questions will never be completely answered, but if you look closely, you will see something that even today, at the heart of history, makes us question what it means to be human. It's not just about physical strength, or hunting prowess, or even the ability to keep a fire lit. It's about an innate desire to keep going, to not yield to the darkness, to never give up. And now, as the wind outside blows ever stronger, it's impossible not to wonder, how far would you go to survive? How far would you go to protect your loved ones, to ensure that tomorrow would still hold some light? The medieval survival story is a story of extreme resilience, of impossible choices, of unthinkable sacrifices, and it will never be forgotten, because it's not just about the past, but about the human spirit, which continues to fight, even when all seems lost. This is the true story of survival. As winter advanced, the land became an extension of the nightmare itself. Beneath the thick layer of snow, villages seemed swallowed by silence. Where there once had been laughter and conversations, now only the sound of embers crackling in homes remained, as if the fire itself were also fighting not to be extinguished. In the minds of the peasants, with each sleepless night, the thought was the same: how much longer will the cold last? And each day, the challenge renewed itself. It wasn't just the fight for food or the fear of the biting cold. It was also the struggle for the spirit. Winter didn't lose its strength. Winter made people question everything, even their very reason for going on. Children, who once ran through the forests, were now shadows of themselves. Their gaze, once bright with curiosity, was now empty, reflecting an uncertain future, where the only certainty was the cold which made every movement slower, more painful. The elders, those who had lived more than their souls could bear, became burdens. There was no more room for kindness. The pain of survival consumed every piece of humanity. But somehow, people still fed on the stories they told each other, on memories of a distant summer, of feasts that would happen someday, or even of something they considered a miracle. However, increasingly, these miracles seemed distant. Who could survive without losing their humanity in such a merciless time? Those houses poorly protected from the wind were no longer safe havens. The fear of fire mingled with the fear of cold. A single mistake when lighting the fire could mean the ruin of the entire village, and in such a cruel winter, ruin meant more than the loss of a home. It meant the loss of everything. And while the average person struggled to bear the weight of the cruelest season, nature didn't stop delivering its blows. The land, still worn by the cold, demanded more than it could offer. Agricultural labor, even in the best of circumstances, was already an exhausting task. Now, under the effects of the relentless winter, the land was exhausted, the fields depleted, and the only remedy available was effort. The harvest, which should have brought hope, was now a farce. What was expected from the land was a burden for those who depended on it for life. The peasants, then, faced another harsh reality. The struggle against the land which, no matter how much they toiled, always seemed to reject their efforts. And when the seeds were finally planted, time showed no gratitude. Every movement in the soil, every small planting, was a gamble on the impossible. All that remained was trust in a future that was far from guaranteed. And as winter faded, there was no certainty that anything would bloom on the edges of that ravaged soil. But even in the face of devastation, something remained firm, something unbreakable: the human spirit. The medieval man, even having been tested to his limits, had not completely yielded. There was something within him, a flame that, no matter how much it was extinguished, still resisted, fighting to survive, as if the act of continuing was a cry against death. And this spirit, however weak it might be, was what separated those who fell from those who still fought. This spirit was seen in the daily struggle, in the nights when the peasants, with no more strength, gathered to talk around the fire, trying, for just another moment, to forget what awaited them. They told stories, shared what little they had, and for an instant, winter didn't seem so terrible. But as soon as the fire went out, reality returned. And as winter yielded its place to spring, fear didn't disappear. It merely transformed. The cold, death, and loss intertwined. And what remained was a struggle for something deeper, the preservation of a spirit that could not be broken, no matter how hostile the world around them was. True survival wasn't just physical. It wasn't just staying alive during the months of ice. True survival was to stay whole. It was not to lose oneself completely, even when everything around them was crumbling. It was to remember who you were, despite the scars, despite the cold, despite the pain. And in the end, the medieval peasant, whom so many saw as simple, wasn't so simple after all. He had faced the worst of nightmares and emerged on the other side, perhaps not unscathed, but with something few could understand. He still carried within him the flame of human resilience, and that flame, however small, was all he had, and that in itself made him a true survivor. As the land slowly began to warm with the arrival of spring, something strange happened. The feeling that the worst was over wasn't an absolute truth. The medieval winter, with its cruelty, wasn't limited to its coldest seasons. Its effects, its weight, still remained, pressing down on every survivor, on every soul that had dared to defy the cold and the darkness. Now the medieval peasant had a new enemy: loss. What remained after the long battle against death was silent solitude. When winter receded, what lingered wasn't just physical weariness, but an internal pain, an invisible pain that many carried without wanting to show others. The loss of friends, of family members, of companions in the struggle. All of this became a shadow that never ceased to drag along. Life, which was once full of movement, was now consumed by a void that could not be filled. Even with spring, bringing with it a promise of new harvests, and the sun's warmth returning, the peasant's heart remained frozen. How could he rejoice in the face of a future that always seemed on the verge of collapse? How could he celebrate the arrival of light when he knew that winter, at any moment, could return and everything he knew could be torn away once more? It was an unending cycle of survival, not just against nature, but against despair itself. Those who survived winter knew that the true battle would never end. They saw themselves as specters wandering a land that always seemed threatened by death. Each new winter would be a reminder that the true fragility of life lay in its unpredictability. Nothing was guaranteed. Everything, at any moment, could be destroyed. And the survivors, how did they deal with it? How did they continue? The answer lay in the small daily victories, in those moments when by the fire, on a frigid night, they sat and told stories, trying to create a new kind of normalcy. Survival wasn't just about the body, but about the spirit, about keeping on, living one day at a time, and perhaps finding a small pleasure in the act of simply continuing to breathe. But there was something that became clear as time passed. The peasants weren't just victims of nature, of the cold, or of the harsh weather. They became masters in the art of resistance. They learned to gaze into the abyss and not be consumed by it. They discovered a strength within themselves that no one would imagine. It wasn't a magical or superhuman strength. It was the strength to resist the impossible, to defy death day after day, without knowing what awaited them in the future. And this, more than anything else, defined the medieval peasant. He wasn't an epic hero, fighting monsters or dragons. No, he was an ordinary human being, with fears, pains, and doubts. But yet, he was capable of something extraordinary. He survived. You might ask yourself, what goes through the mind of someone who faced so much pain, so much loss, so much struggle, and still kept going? What goes through the mind of a person who saw death up close, who was touched by hopelessness, but who rose again? The truth is, when all that's left is the fight for life, the human spirit finds ways to resist. And in the end, survival isn't about defeating nature or death. Survival is about defeating yourself. As spring arrived, the peasant looked to the horizon and knew there was nothing more to fear, because he had already faced the worst. And deep down, he knew that whatever season approached, he was ready. He had become something stronger than the conditions, more resilient than any natural force. He was, now, a true survivor. And perhaps, deep down, that's what the story of medieval survival teaches us, that no matter how relentless the challenges, the human spirit is capable of reinventing itself and persisting. It can be broken, but never destroyed. It can be tested, but never fully defeated. The cold arrived like a silent shadow, blanketing the earth with its relentless shroud. It wasn't an ordinary winter, but the one medieval peasants feared, which tested the limits of human endurance, consuming not only bodies, but also hopes. Behind each falling snowflake, there was a challenge, a battle for life that unfolded in silence within poorly heated cabins and frozen forests. Imagine yourself in a small medieval village, where the biting winds aren't just an inconvenience, but a silent assassin, stealing the body's strength and the soul's courage. Inside a house of mud and wood, the warmth of the fire is your only friend, but even it seems to be a treacherous ally. Each night, the fire dies down faster, the embers extinguish, and the cold seems to swallow everything. The air becomes dense, heavy. The sound of wood crackling, breaking under the pressure of the fire, is the only thing you hear, but even that can't shake the feeling that somehow you are losing the fight. You can feel the cold in your bones, even inside the cabin, where there's barely room to move. The heat, when it comes, is weak and quickly dissipates. leaving you with the feeling that life is slipping away. Every breath is an effort, as if the frozen air were trying to enter your very body, freezing your insides. And when you look out the window, the scene outside is a white desert, where the horizon is covered by a thick layer of snow, and the trees, stripped of life, stretch towards the sky like fleshless skeletons. It's as if the world itself has been seized by death. Now imagine you are a medieval peasant, struggling to stay alive. There are few resources. What you had to survive was the land, the little you could plant and hunt. But winter, with its frozen fury, took everything from you. Food becomes scarce. The frozen fields no longer produce. Hunting in the forests, once a source of sustenance, has now become an impossible mission. There's no way to keep livestock when the cold corrodes everything it touches. And the nights are long, almost endless. Sleep is interrupted by the need to check the fire, to ensure that the hearth is still alive, that you and your family won't be taken by the relentless cold. Winter is an invisible prison that holds you captive, and the struggle for survival is an endless cycle. Each passing day, each gust of wind, each snowflake, is a reminder that, if you are not strong, if you do not resist, death will be the only companion left. But the peasants knew that the struggle wasn't limited to the cold. It was a constant war against the unknown. The fear of diseases, the risk of hunger, the scarcity of resources, all of this added more weight to the battle. There were no doctors to heal the sick, no pharmacies or hospitals where you could seek help. And if winter dragged on for months, you were vulnerable not only to the cold, but also to the plague which spread with terrifying speed, without any warning. But somehow people managed to continue. What kept them standing? What made them persist when all seemed lost? Was the inner flame that winter could not extinguish. It was a flame that came from the heart, from the courage to live, from the need to resist, to keep fighting, not to be defeated. It was a force that, no matter how much the world tried to destroy it, refused to be extinguished. And in the midst of this struggle, moments arose that reminded us of the humanity that still remained. Because even in those times of pain and suffering, there was room for kindness. People, despite their own difficulties, helped each other. Those who had more shared with those who had less, shared fire on frigid nights. Food divided in the darkest hours were small but powerful gestures that demonstrated that, even in the cruelest winter, humanity still existed. But then, a new winter arrived, and the cycle began again. The medieval winter was a season that left no room for rest. It was a season that brought with it the specter of death and abandonment. And those who survived over the years learned to fear the arrival of each new winter, because they knew that no matter how much they resisted, they would never be completely safe. They had already seen too much. They had already lost more than they could bear. And when spring finally arrived, it wasn't a celebration. It wasn't the relief so many hoped for, because spring brought with it the memory of all that had been lost, of all that had to be sacrificed to survive. The seeds planted in the frozen lands weren't just food. They were a symbol of resilience, a desperate attempt to renew what winter had tried to destroy. But what remained was a broken spirit, a soul marked by the constant struggle for life. And in the end, that's where the true essence of survival lies. It's not just about surviving winter, it's about surviving what it represents, the eternal cycle of life and death, of struggle and loss, of resilience and acceptance. The medieval peasant, like each of us, faced winter not just as a season, but as a reflection of the immense difficulties everyone faces in their lives. Now I ask you, do you have what it takes to face your own winter? Because just like the medieval peasant, all of us face periods of darkness, of cold, of seemingly insurmountable difficulties. And the real question is, how will you react? Will you let fear consume you? Will you give up when the fight seems too much? Or will you find within yourself the strength to resist, to continue, to fight for your own survival? If you want to learn how to overcome life's adversities and find strength in the darkest hours, be sure to follow our content. We are together on this journey, and no matter how hard the path, together we can find the courage to continue. Click here to continue your journey of learning and discovery, and never forget, winter may be cruel, but human resilience is stronger.